Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Cavanaugh. Yeah, my name is Shai Ferraro. I'm the secretary of the Israeli Association for the Study of Religions, and this is our final session, a plenary session that will sum up our 7th yearly conference, 7th annual conference, which took place mostly physically in the Open University at Ra'anana, on the suburbs of Israel. We had quite an eventful day and a half. We started yesterday with a special plenary session commemorating Dr. Chaim Katzman, who was murdered in the October 7th Hamas attacks. Yeah, and he was a religious studies scholar, wrote a brilliant PhD, so we had this family with us. We also heard from one of his thesis advisors, Professor James K. Wallman from University of Washington in Seattle, who spoke very highly of him, and his words were really moving, and I will upload them afterwards to the IASR's YouTube, so we can share them with everyone. And then we moved on to the Verblovsky Prize for doctoral dissertations in the study of religions, which was also a very which was a joyous event. And then we heard from Dr. Sarah Cohen from University of Vienna, who spoke to us about Sufi eco-spirituality, protecting endangered animals in Bangladesh and Pakistan. So that was yesterday, yeah. Today we had 12 sessions from morning till to the late afternoon, and I barely made it from Ra'anana to Haifa to start this Zoom, and I'm very, very happy to have Bill Cavanaugh here with us. But first, I'll share the platform with our IASR president, Professor Itamar Greenwald, who would say a few words, and we'll also present Professor Cavanaugh. So to you, Itamar.
Thank you very much, Shai. Good evening to everyone here who is joining us on Zoom, which is what should we know? One of the wonders of the modern world, that we can join together on one screen and cross oceans and continents and have guests from other countries with us. Tonight we have here tonight in Chicago, it's late morning, Professor T. Cavanaugh, Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Center for the World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago. DePaul University in Chicago is a Catholic university, well known and with a long history of famous scholars. And we are proud to have Professor Cavanaugh with us this evening. It is an interesting topic which Professor Cavanaugh will address, two opposing directions in modern theology. It's anthropocentrism and theocentrism, and the idea that gave rise to the problem of ecology and the damage that human beings, anthropocentrism, does to nature is very much discussed presently, mostly, I think, due to an encyclical of Pope Francis, the current Pope in Rome, who in 29th of May 2015, that is almost a bit over 9 years ago, published an encyclical which he called Laudato Si, I praise of you, which follows a poem by St. Francis of Assisi. The connection between the present Paul and Francis of Assisi is that the present Pope is the first Pope whose name is Francis. He is not called Francis the First, but just Francis, because he is the first who took on the name of Francis in honor of Francis of Assisi. And Francis of Assisi, in his poem, tries to speak of nature in terms of sister and mother, and the deep relationship that is required between man and his environment in terms of mother and sister. I think that enough is now said by way of introducing Professor Cavanaugh, and let's see how he creates an intellectual ecology of this matter.
Well, thanks so much, Itamar and Shai, for the invitation and for your kind words of welcome. I already kind of feel like I'm among friends. I wish I could be there in person with you all. I have never been to Israel, the Holy Land, and I was really looking forward to being there, but I'm sure we can all join together in wishing and praying for peace, and hopefully we'll meet in person sometime in the future. So I've been asked to talk about ecological crisis from the point of view of a Catholic theologian, and I want to start with this concept of anthropocentrism, because it's often said to be the root of the ecological crisis, the glorification of the human person to a position of mastery over nature. So rather than seeing humans as part of nature, anthropocentrism elevates humans to this uniquely privileged position. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this going?
Yeah.
Okay. And simultaneously, then the natural world gets reduced to mere raw material. And so the natural world is instrumentalized and disenchanted and so on. And so anthropocentrism leads to the exploitation of nature and the breakdown of natural systems. Lynn White's famous 1967 article that always gets cited, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, it lays the blame on Christian anthropocentrism. He declares, quote, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. Christianity not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it's God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. And so White traces anthropocentrism to the biblical creation story. The humans should subdue the earth, dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. And White says, quote, God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes, end quote. So the solution to this distortion, according to many environmental ethicists, is to replace an anthropocentric view with an ecocentric or biocentric view, one that decenters humanity and recognizes the intrinsic value of all nature independent of human needs and desires. So in this talk, I want to examine that debate in the light of recent Catholic social teaching And I want to argue that while Catholic social teaching critiques anthropocentrism, it also suggests way that the critique of anthropocentrism is insufficiently nuanced and in fact distorts the real causes of the degradation of the environment. And then I'm going to talk about Catholic critiques of ecocentrism and finally end up showing how and why Catholic social teaching promotes what Pope Francis calls an integral ecology, which is based on a theocentric worldview. So the critique of anthropocentrism is what I'll start out with. It's undergone some development in Catholic social teaching. Pope John Paul II often stressed ecological concerns and the integrity of creation, but nevertheless, his emphasis was on the proper stewardship of creation by humans, and he actually uses the term anthropocentrism positively to emphasize human dignity. So he talks about the organic linking of anthropocentrism and theocentrism in Jesus Christ. In his 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, he invokes the language of Genesis, and he writes, quote, "The original source of all that is good is the very act of God, who created both the earth and man, and who gave the earth to man so that he might have dominion over it by his work and enjoy its fruits. It is through work that man, using his intelligence and exercising his freedom, succeeds in dominating the earth and making it a fitting home," end quote. So there's this jarring language of domination, and he also emphasizes the relative importance of what he calls human ecology over natural ecology. And so he says that although animal habitats are important to safeguard, quote, "too little effort is made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology," end quote. And what he means by that includes sanctity of life, marriage, family, and so on. So his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, made environmental concerns an important theme in his papacy. In the 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate, he opposes both, quote, "the total technical domination of man over nature," but also rejects, on the other hand, a kind of neo-paganism or pantheism that sees nature as something more important than the human person. And so our attitude towards nature should aim for wise use and not its reckless exploitation. So Benedict backs away from John Paul II's language of domination and anthropocentrism, but he also juxtaposes environmental ecology with what he calls human ecology, again, which likewise is about life, sexuality, marriage, family, and so on. And he says, quote, "In order to protect nature, it's not enough to intervene with economic incentives or deterrents. The decisive issue is the overall moral tenor of society," end quote. And so lose the right to life and environmental ecology will suffer as well. So after its introduction in 1991, this term human ecology became a term that in some Catholic circles was used to downplay concern over the environment in favor of concerns over abortion and other issues of family and sexuality. Pope Francis doesn't abandon the term entirely, but in his encyclical 2015 Laudato Si, the few references to human ecology are linked not just to sexual difference, but also to networks of solidarity and proper housing. Most importantly, rather than juxtapose human and natural ecology, Francis repeatedly uses the term integral ecology to stress the embeddedness of human beings and networks of relationship with the natural world. And so he appears less worried than his predecessors that concern for the environment will lead to pantheism. He draws on the nature mysticism of Francis of Assisi to address the earth as mother and sister. And he devotes, though, an entire subsection of Laudato Si to what he calls, quote, "the crisis and effects of modern anthropocentrism," what he also calls the tyrannical and irresponsible domination of human beings over other creatures. Quote, "We have come to see ourselves as the earth's lords and masters entitled to plunder her at will," end quote. So, but unlike Lynn White and others, he blames anthropocentrism not on the Bible, but on a misreading of the Bible. He says the creation story in Genesis is God-centered. It's not human-centered, right? Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's, right? And we are not the Lord. And so he declares clearly the Bible has no place for tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcerned for other creatures. End quote. He says the Bible does recognize the uniqueness of the human being, but doesn't thereby make other living beings mere objects subjected to arbitrary human domination. So he rejects that term domination. So it appears that under Pope Francis, official Catholic social thought has embraced this common critique of anthropocentrism as the root of the ecological crisis, although he disagrees with Lynn White on whether you can blame it on the Bible. Now, I think the critique of anthropocentrism has merit. Humanity in the aggregate has assumed a position of domination and exploitation over the world's resources with devastating consequences for animals and plants and the rest of the environment. But I want to suggest that there are some important elements missing in this critique, and I'm going to talk about three of them. First, the critique of anthropocentrism treats ideas as the driver of history and downplays material causes. Second, it regards humanity or man in the aggregate without distinguishing among the captains of industry whose constant search for shareholder value drives ecological degradation, the relatively affluent consumers whose lifestyle demands this exploitation of natural resources. On the other hand, the billions whose levels of consumption barely arise above subsistence. And then fourthly, finally, the workers whose labor constitutes another resource to be exploited. So the critique of anthropocentrism, in other words, avoids class analysis and is therefore too blunt an instrument, I'm going to argue. Thirdly, the critique of anthropocentrism doesn't recognize the way that things, not people, have been put in the center of a consumer society. People are not simply masters of nature, but rather subject to material idols of our own making. So I'll argue, nevertheless, that Catholic social thought has resources to address these problems in the critique of anthropocentrism. So let me start with the first problem. The critique of anthropocentrism generally suffers from an overemphasis of ideas as the driver of history, as if there's one dominant view of man in Western society that has wreaked havoc on the environment. Lynn White's thesis has been critiqued for this fallacy, both because it makes these overgeneralizations about a large and complex faith system, and because subsequent attempts by sociologists to document a clear effect of the beliefs of any world religion on environmental concerns have failed. So it's not this kind of simple, people believe these things and then it goes wrong. So Pope Benedict, I don't think, is wrong to say that, quote, the decisive issue is the overall moral tenor of society, end quote. But moral values, I think, are just as much an effect as a cause of larger economic and social systems like capitalism. You don't have to be a Marxist to recognize that environmental destruction is driven not just by bad values or by the Genesis creation story, but by the search for profit, right? As Michael Parenti writes, quote, the essence of capitalism, its raison d'etre, is to convert nature into commodities and commodities into capital, transforming the living earth into inanimate wealth. This capital accumulation process wreaks havoc on the global ecological system, end quote. And that process continues despite the moral values that people claim to espouse. Secondly, the critique of anthropocentrism treats humanity or man in the aggregate as the problem, thus ignoring the fact that humanity is sharply divided by class and other boundaries with widely differing effects on the environment. So some have the ability to consume vastly disproportionate quantities of the world's resources, while others struggle just to feed themselves and their families. Hundreds of millions of subsistence farmers cultivate land sustainably, while profitable agribusinesses clear-cut forests and pollute water supplies. There's a yawning divide between those who toil in fields and mines and factories for little remuneration and the shareholders who profit from such labor. Those who labor generally do not experience themselves as exercising dominion, but rather being instrumentalized for the profit of others. Right? So anthropocentrism, I think, is just not a temptation for those billions of human beings mired in poverty and struggling to live dignified lives. Their experience is not mastery over the earth, but rather being mastered by other human beings. So the exploitation of the earth and its resources is in some ways inexplicable without the exploitation of human beings. The idea that we are too human-centered is an added insult to the billions of excluded and discarded people. So any critique of anthropocentrism, therefore, needs to be disaggregated into a critique of the rampant inequality and injustice that divides humanity into the haves and the have-nots. So in Laudato Si, Pope Francis's concern over anthropocentrism is framed by his constant effort to understand ecological destruction and poverty together. So he's attentive to the disproportionate effects of consumption by the wealthy. He writes, quote, "We should be particularly indignant at the enormous inequalities in our midst, whereby we continue to tolerate some considering themselves more worthy than others. We fail to see that some are mired in desperate and degrading poverty with no way out, while others have not the faintest idea what to do with their possessions, vainly showing off their supposed superiority and leaving behind them so much waste, which, if it were the case everywhere, would destroy the planet," end quote. So in addition to consumption, Francis is also keenly aware of the link between environmental degradation and poverty in terms of production. So he writes, quote, "When nature is viewed solely as a source of profit and gain, this has serious consequences. This vision of might is right has engendered immense inequality, injustice, and acts of violence against the majority of humanity, since resources end up in the hands of the first comer or the most powerful, the winner takes all. Completely at odds with this model are the ideals of harmony, justice, fraternity, and peace as proposed by Jesus," end quote. So here Francis explicitly links the exploitation of nature with the exploitation of human beings. Inequality is not just the result of the rich ignoring or refusing to share with the poor, but is rather a matter of injustice and violence against the non-rich majority of humanity. And that's why Francis says, quote, "A true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor," end quote. And so he makes clear that the ecological crisis is at its root a problem of our economic system and not just, the Genesis story or bad values. The environmental crisis, he writes, quote, "will continue to worsen if we continue with current models of production and consumption. The Earth's resources are being plundered because of short-sighted approaches to the economy, commerce, and production," end quote. So he explicitly criticizes the idea that the market will eventually solve our ecological problems and that pursuing the maximization of profits is sufficient. The effects on the environment and on the poor are equally devastating. So rivers in Bangladesh have turned red from the garment industry's waste. And just the minimum wage for Bangladeshi garment workers was raised in November of 2023, more than 50%, but it still amounts to less than $5 for a 10-hour workday. So the throwaway culture is a theme to which Francis often returns. It's a central metaphor that refers both to the trashing of the Earth's resources and also the discarding of people. So for Francis, the throwaway of human beings refers to the exploitation of labor for profit, the premature death of millions of poor people, the status of migrants, forced labor, racism, abortion, and he lists a host of other economic and social problems under this idea of the throwaway culture. In another document, Evangelii Gaudium, Francis writes, quote, "Human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture, which is now spreading." end quote. And he continues on to say, it is no longer simply about exploitation and oppression, but something new. And so he expands the critique beyond Marx. The excluded are not just the exploited, but also the outcast. So in other words, for a lot of people, the only thing worse than having a job in a sweatshop is not having a job in a sweatshop, right? Robotics and artificial intelligence are making increasing numbers of people redundant. So when the ideal is more consumption and less work, the reality is a small circle of consumers and their commodities and a growing expanse of discarded humanity whose labor isn't even necessary anymore. So at the root of the problem is not simply the dominance of humanity in the aggregate over nature, but rather the actions of those who direct and profit from the economy. And Francis can get quite specific about this. He attacks both the privatization of common resources like water and the externalization of costs through environmental destruction and pollution. Quote, in a word, businesses profit by calculating and paying only a fraction of the costs involved, end quote. So as long as they're not paying them, they don't care about the environmental costs. The problem is not humanity in the aggregate, but global inequities between the haves and the have-nots. Companies pursue profits at the expense of both the poor and the earth. These inequities, Francis writes, pervade not only relations between individuals, but international relations as well. Overconsumption by the global north disproportionately affects the poor in the south. So he quotes the bishops of Argentina, pointing out that multinational corporations based in the north, quote, do here in the south what they would never do in developed countries or the so-called first world, end quote. So they extract raw materials and leave behind environmental devastation. So Francis criticizes economic arrangements that, quote, only serve the economic interests of transnational corporations. The principle of the maximization of profits, frequently isolated from other considerations, reflects a misunderstanding of the very concept of the economy, end quote. So this is an attack on the very heart of a capitalist economy based on the principle that the business corporation's primary and some would say only responsibility is to pursue shareholder value through the maximization of profits. So what alternative principle would reflect an understanding of a sane economy? Well, Francis lays it out in Laudato Si, quote, the principle of the subordination of private property to the universal destination of goods. End quote. So since God created the world for everyone, the earth is essentially a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. Private property, of course, is recognized by the Catholic tradition, but it's not absolute or inviolable. As Thomas Aquinas held, private property is lawful with regard to ownership, but with regard to use, quote, man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that he is ready to communicate them to others in their need, end quote. That's, again, Aquinas. And this is what John Paul II called the social mortgage on all private property. It's meant to be used for the benefit of all, not only the few. And so Francis writes, quote, an integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good, a central and unifying principle of social ethics, end quote. So another famous environmental essay from the 1960s, Garrett Hardin's essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, contended controversially that common access to resources leads to overuse and degradation. Pope Francis, on the other hand, sees the privatization of resources as the root of ecological destruction. If the primary motive is private profit for the shareholders, the use of both the earth and human labor will be subordinated to the profit motive, and both the earth and humans will suffer. If we can view the use of resources through the lens of the common good of all, then we can discern which uses work to the benefit of the entire creation and which do not. And this means in turn that, quote, the principle of the common good immediately becomes logically and inevitably a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters, end quote. So a principle that prioritizes the flourishing of the whole creation rather than the generation of private profit will necessarily turn its attention to the areas of the earth that are most endangered and to the poor people who most suffer from the exploitation of labor and the degradation of their living spaces. So the point of all this, again, is that the critique of anthropocentrism is radically incomplete if it doesn't disaggregate the domination of humanity over nature. At the root of the ecological crisis is the domination of some humans over nature and the domination of some humans over other people. Opposing ecological destruction means opposing the widening gap between the owners of capital and labor. The Catholic tradition does not thereby embrace abolishing private property or the coercive centralization of ownership in the state. Popes Benedict and Francis frequently encourage the decentralization of economic power into communal projects, cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, small-scale farming, and so on. So, for example, Francis writes, there is a great variety, quote, there is a great variety of small-scale food production systems which feed the greater part of the world's peoples, using a modest amount of land and producing less waste, be it in small agricultural parcels, orchards and gardens, hunting and wild harvesting, or local fishing, end quote. So an economy for people, not profit, is simultaneously what Francis calls an economic ecology and an ecological economy. Okay, so I've talked about two problems with the critique of anthropocentrism. The third problem with the idea that anthropocentrism is at the heart of the ecological crisis is that in many ways our economy centers things and not people. And this is the heart of Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, right? In the market, commodities take on life and enter into relationship with one another, while the social relationships among human beings that go into the production of things, who's laboring for whom, under what conditions, for what pay, and so on, those are all hidden. And Marx calls this the conversion of things into persons and the conversion of persons into things. He was writing before the full emergence of a consumer society and well before the appearance of online shopping. But what he's talking about here can be illustrated by the domination of Amazon on online shopping. When you shop on Amazon, all you see are pictures of products with prices and reviews. So entirely absent are the human beings that make the products, any information about where they work, how the materials that went into the product are sourced, how workers are paid and treated, the environmental consequences of production and distribution, and so on. So human beings and the natural environment are eliminated from our view, and all we see are products. So we click, and the product appears abracadabra on our doorstep without having any contact with another human person. So the Amazon packages just they've got a smile on them. On the commercials, they sing and dance. The things have been converted into persons. And this process takes flight in the late 19th century into the 20th. Until the Industrial Revolution, people made most of the things they owned, or they knew the person who made them. So even after the shift to a cash economy, stores sold generic goods, oats from a barrel, chairs and shirts without names. Only in the 1880s did branded and packaged items start to replace locally produced bulk items. So the Quaker Oats man appears in 1888, and from then on, products take on personality and life. Tony the Tiger and, the iconic, I don't know if you remember the iconic Oscar Mayer ad, "My bologna has a first name, it's OSCAR," and so on. There's an extensive scholarly literature exploring brand personality, animism, anthropomorphism, fetishism in consumer products. And the question is why, right? Why does my bologna have a first name? Anthropologists and economic historians think that once products were disembedded from social relationships, once we no longer knew the producer or the shopkeeper, advertising encouraged us to develop relationships with brands. So the human need for relationship would be transferred to things in order to better sell products. So we relate to commodities, and this has the added effect of dampening our curiosity about the people who make commodities and the environmental costs involved. And again, you don't need Marx to make this analysis. It's found in Catholic social thought as well, as we've already seen in Francis's denunciation of turning people into disposable things. And the popes also write about the idolization of consumer items in the market itself. So not just the personification, but the deification of things that corresponds to the reification of persons. Pope Benedict, for example, compared a consumer economy to Psalm 135, in which the attribution of life to wooden idols takes life away from their human makers. In Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II warns of, quote, the idolatry of the market, which ignores the existence of goods by which their nature are not and cannot be mere commodities, end quote. And Pope Francis's first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, makes clear that abandoning belief in God does not mean abandoning belief, but rather the proliferation of gods. Quote, an aimless passing from one Lord to another. Those who choose not to put their trust in God must hear the din of countless idols crying out, put your trust in me. And Francis frequently uses the language of idolatry when he talks about the current economic system. He talks about the idols of profit and consumption, the road of covetousness, which ends in idolatry. So our economic system, Francis thinks, is not secular. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis refers to, quote, the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. And he notes, quote, whatever is fragile like the environment is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which become the only rule, end quote. Okay, so to sum up the talk so far, the critique of anthropocentrism as the cause of environmental degradation, I think, needs to be qualified and is in some ways in Catholic social thought by a recognition that it's not just bad values, but our economic system that causes both the degradation of humans into disposable things and the elevation of commodities into idols. So billions of people experience the world not as human-centric, but rather as one in which humans and the earth are both subject to commodities and capital as if they were gods. So those who think of that the root of the ecological crisis is anthropocentrism often offer ecocentrism or biocentrism as the solution, right? Nature should be seen as having intrinsic value independent of human beings. But this raises some difficult questions, right? Does moral consideration apply to living things only or inanimate things like rocks? Does it apply to every individual thing or only to species and ecosystems? Are viruses included, right? Does a malaria-bearing mosquito have the same right to life as a sleeping human child who's about to get bitten? And it's moreover the case that all participants in these debates are humans, right? Making judgments about human actions. As Ian Angus puts it, quote, no one suggests that bears or coyotes should be persuaded to accept that rabbits and squirrels have a moral right to live. Only humans can make such judgments and behave accordingly. In that practical sense, humans can only be anthropocentric, end quote. So Pope Francis addresses this argument for biocentrism in Laudato Si, where he observes, quote, a constant schizophrenia wherein a technocracy which sees no intrinsic value in lesser beings coexists with the other extreme, which sees no special value in human beings, end quote. And so he says that when we see humans as merely a part of nature, as a product of chance or physical determinism, our overall sense of responsibility wanes. Quote, a misguided anthropocentrism need not necessarily yield to biocentrism, for that would entail adding yet another imbalance. Human beings cannot be expected to feel responsibility for the world unless, at the same time, their unique capacities of knowledge, will, freedom, and responsibility are recognized and valued, end quote. So in other words, bears and coyotes and rabbits and squirrels need us to do their thinking for them. Francis worries as well that biocentrism will ignore our responsibility towards other suffering human beings. Biocentrism, he says, can easily devolve into a romantic individualism that wants to enjoy nature free of the burden of other people. So, final section of the paper then on theocentrism. How can the interests of humans and nature be brought into a proper balance? For the Catholic tradition, the only resolution to this tug of war between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism is theocentrism. As Francis writes, the forgetting of God, quote, is how we end up worshiping earthly powers or ourselves usurping the place of God, even to the point of claiming an unlimited right to trample his creation underfoot. The best way to restore men and women to their rightful place, putting an end to their claim of absolute dominion over the earth, is to speak once more of the figure of a father who creates and who alone owns the world. Otherwise, human beings will always try to impose their own laws and interests on reality, end quote. So theocentrism lowers the status of those who would dominate the earth, but raises the status of those people who are instrumentalized by others. All people are made in the image of God. Likewise, theocentrism both denies the idolization of the material world and simultaneously elevates it to the status of creation that shows forth the beauty of God. So I want to talk about those two things. First, the status of material creation. Pope Francis writes, quote, when we can see God reflected in all that exists, our hearts are moved to praise the Lord for all his creatures and to worship him in union with them, end quote. So in the hymn from Francis of Assisi that follows this passage, the earth is not mother, but sister and brother. The earth is not worshipped, but loved and honored as brother wind and sister water, which reflect the glory of the Father. So the purpose of creation is to point to God. As the Book of Wisdom declares, quote, for from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. So each creature in its own way opens a door to another world. The being of creatures is ecstatic. The center of all creatures is in God. And yet this theocentric vision is not a turning away from this world to another world, a turning away from created things and toward God. It's in God that creatures are shown to be what they really are. We only see creation rightly when we see it in God. So not mere dead matter, but as pulsing with the divine. We see what the creation actually is when we see it kind of pulsing with the divine. So Pope Francis sees the universe as full of sacramental signs. Quote, there is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face, end quote. So again, he refuses to separate nature from humanity, the leaf from the poor person. The sacraments, however, always both reveal and conceal. They provide access to an invisible grace while cloaking that grace in material signs. So creatures image God, but are not God. The unlikeness between God and creatures is the condition of the intimacy between God and creatures, right? So precisely because God is not a being, but is the very ground of being, God is present in each thing, as Aquinas says, innermostly, right? So the complete otherness of God doesn't diminish the beauty of creation. On the contrary, as Junius Johnson writes, quote, the greatness of the difference between God and creatures is what guarantees that there will be no competition. And so God is free to pour God's self richly into creatures without fear that they will be in danger of no longer being creatures or of being seen as more than creatures, end quote. So a sacramental view of creation avoids both the instrumentalization and the idolization of the material world. Creation is neither reduced to raw material for the satisfaction of human wants, nor on the other hand is it fetishized, exalted to the status of the divine. A proper relationship to creation sees it as God's gift, both saturated with the presence of God and yet for that reason eccentric, pointing to a center outside of itself in God. So in a sacramental view, creation comes alive precisely in its witnessing to the gift which grounds its being. So creation comes alive in that view. Pope Francis is insistent, however, that this sacramental view not be a mere romantic aesthetic for individuals to appreciate nature. An integral ecology sees both the leaf and the poor person's face together as creations reflecting the love of the Father. So this dynamic is most powerfully expressed in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, says Francis, where creator and creation are united in a human person, a poor one who is tortured to death. Christ is a sacrament of God, and the poor are a sacrament of Christ. Humanity and divinity are united in Christ, but in a way that avoids both the instrumentalization and the idolatry of human being. In Christ, humanity mediates divine presence, even though divine presence is not circumscribed by Christ's humanity. So in the Catholic view, Christ reveals what it means to be human. A theocentric view that incorporates both material creation and humanity is found most directly in the Catholic tradition in the sacrament of the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, Catholics believe the body of Christ is both what the material creation of bread and wine become and what human beings become. So we eat the body of Christ and become the body of Christ. The act of consumption is curiously inverted, such that instead of assimilating what we eat into our bodies, we are consumed and become part of Christ's body. So rather than isolate us into a relationship with things, the act of consumption incorporates us into this larger body, one in which, as Paul says, quote, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. So there can be no throwaway people because we're members of the same body, and we're to consider the weakest members as indispensable, Paul says, and give the greatest honor to the most inferior members. And indeed, we share the same nervous system, says Paul, quote, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it, end quote. So Pope Francis emphasizes how the sacraments take the elements of nature like wheat and water into a mediation of divine life. The day of the Eucharist, the Sabbath, puts work in a cosmic context, he says, quote, rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest centered on the Eucharist sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to greater concern for nature and the poor, end quote. Nature and the poor. So this concern can't be a mere aesthetic, it has to be an ethic as well, a way of living, a new economy that allows humans and all creatures together to flourish as reflections of the love of God. So concluding then, in addressing the ecological crisis, we too often pit humans versus nature and assume that the exaltation of humanity over nature is the root problem. But I've suggested that such critiques are incomplete at best, since billions of people in our current economic system experience themselves as dominated, not dominant, and our economy often centers commodities, not humans. So what's needed is an integral economy, an integral ecology, and a better economy that neither instrumentalizes nor idolizes nature or humanity, but rather allows them to show forth the beauty of God. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cavanaugh, for a very illuminating talk, which shows that at least Catholicism has a deep say on the modern discussion of ecology, which is not self-evident, but really rather for most of us a unique experience. Not every religion and not everywhere does religion take a stand on ecological problems. And your talk made it very clear that Catholicism does take a stand through mostly the work of Pope Francis. One question, I think that it is interesting to note that Pope Francis connects himself to Francis of Assisi, but I think his roots in Latin America somehow also connect him to liberal theology of Latin America, which has a deep say on these matters. Why does he change direction in his perception of the issue?
Yeah, I don't think it really changes direction so much as kind of incorporates some of the later concerns in liberation theology for ecology. So Leonardo Boff, for example, one of the prominent liberation theologians in Latin America, was writing, who's also a Franciscan, or was a Franciscan anyway, was writing about ecology as part of liberation, kind of trying to see the relationship between the poor of the earth and the poor earth, the kind of exploitation of people and the environment. And so Boff was writing about this in the 80s already. And I think Pope Francis has probably picked up on some of that and amplified it. But I mean, all of this is you know, oftentimes the Catholic tradition is late coming to realizations. You know, it's a tradition that moves fairly slowly. So it's really just since Laudato Si in 2015 that the Catholic tradition has really had a lot to say on ecology, although you can find roots of it much earlier than that.
Thank you. If there is anybody in the audience that would like to comment or ask a question.
I would like to ask a question, if it's okay. So actually, I have two questions. One is that I mean, it was fascinating, first of all, and I was wondering, I was kind of expecting natural law to somehow come up in your talk, and I was surprised that it wasn't there. And of course, this is both because of the public discourse and so how important that is, but it's also because I read in Benedict a while ago his criticism on the concept of human rights that you try to find in nature from a secular perspective, but once you dismiss the idea that nature somehow expresses divine reason, then it's no longer possible to use nature as a model for morality. So yeah, so I was wondering how this, if this is related to what you are suggesting, and if you want, I can ask the other question already, or we can wait.
Maybe wait and let me respond to that one first. Yeah, I always have trouble keeping more than one question in mind at a time. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'm just not. I mean, there are some Catholic thinkers that are really into natural law, and I'm just not one of them, right? Because part of the problem is that, I mean, some people use natural law to kind of get around revelation, right? So we're not going to talk about the Bible. We're gonna use natural law to kind of try to find some sort of foundation where you don't have to rely on revelation. And I think that's a really bad idea from a theological point of view. The other thing one of the other problems with natural law is that one of the other ways it gets used is that Catholics tend to use it to kind of co-opt the conversation and make it seem universal, as if there's this natural law out there that we all agree on. But of course, Catholics think that natural law is universal and everybody else thinks natural law is Catholic, right? So that's part, right? So that's part of, if there were this kind of obvious natural law out there, then we would have had agreement a long time ago, right? So it's a way of kind of co-opting the conversation that I don't find very honest in a lot of ways. So I tend to kind of shy away from language of natural law. But I think there are uses of natural law that can be useful, especially when you're talking about nature and the environment here. And I tend to think that the proper uses of natural law are more ontological than epistemological. And what I mean by that is that what you're saying when you're talking about the natural law is that there are that God is invested through the creation in the structures of the universe, right? And that's an ontological claim, and I think it's an important claim for a theologian to make. I don't buy the kind of epistemological argument that therefore we can read off from nature, what we need to do, and that oftentimes I think is just a subterfuge to try to, make something sound universal when it's actually not. So I hope that's helpful.
Very, thank you.
I can to ask?
Yeah. Please, Shmuel, ask your question, and then we'll move to Karma's second question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And I want to ask you next question. What exactly Catholic religion speak? What the opinion of Catholic religion about subjects of food security and recycling different types of waste?
Right, yeah. I think that's Pope Francis talks about both of those topics in Laudato Si and elsewhere. When he talks about waste, he often uses, as I mentioned in the talk, this kind of metaphor of the throwaway culture. And so he comes back to this a lot, that we've got this some of the world's people have this abundance to such an extent that a lot of food gets wasted and thrown away, and all sorts of things get wasted and thrown away. And this is consuming the natural environment at the same time. And then he also links that to the kind of throwaway people, that he says that this is what's happening with people. So there's one segment, a small segment of humanity that's wasting and throwing things away. And then there's another much larger segment of humanity that's being thrown away, that they're either kind of excluded from the environment or they're being consumed by, their labor and their, the places that they live and so on are just being consumed by this economy. So, when I gave one little example where he talks about food production at a sort of local level that oftentimes produces less waste and actually feeds the majority of the world's people. And unfortunately, so many times, like I think the World Bank and other organizations have gotten the idea that subsistence farming is a negative, and what you really need are export economies. You need to get big or get out, and you need economies of scale in order for people to enter into the economy. And Francis and Benedict before him are much more interested in trying to keep food production at the local level, because they think that works to feed people, not to romanticize subsistence farming, but it's oftentimes much more gentle on people and the environment than agribusinesses coming in and kind of clear cutting, like in the Gambella region of Ethiopia, for example, an Indian agribusiness came in and basically the government helped them push subsistence farmers off the land, and they turned it all into palm oil plantations with devastating consequences. So thanks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
maybe Ken can go now because I already spoke.
Okay, thank you, Karma. I actually also have two questions, so we can switch between us. It was very interesting. Therefore, we Israelis always get these questions going. So actually, one thing I was wondering about is a bit maybe off from what you said, or maybe taking off from what you said. I was wondering how much all of what you said about Catholicism kind of penetrates and affects other denominations of Christianity. Especially, I'm interested to know about the evangelists in the United States. Do they listen to these voices? Do they, how do they look at all of these perspectives that you were describing?
Yeah, good question. So your answer to the question, do American evangelicals listen to what the Pope has to say on this, is a pretty definite no. Right. Yeah, I mean, but of course, a lot of Catholics don't listen to what the Pope has to say about it either, right? I mean, things have become so polarized politically in the United States that oftentimes the issue of the environment and climate change is also seen as a political issue. And if you're a Democrat, you are in favor of environmental regulation. And if you're a Republican, you're against it. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians and people of other faiths as well, the politics determines the theology and not vice versa. And so, but there's a particular problem with white evangelicals in the United States, and for them very heavily. I mean, 80% of them voted for Trump, and very heavily they tend to oppose environmental regulation, and they oftentimes will use as their justification, on the one hand, the Genesis account. So you do find people kind of appealing to this account of the, having dominion over the earth. And on the other hand, they often appeal to apocalyptic kinds of theologies where the earth is going to be destroyed soon by God anyway, and so there's no need to be overly concerned about it. And they see, concern about the earth as being kind of, pantheism or paganism and so on. So, yeah, so I wish I had more encouraging news to give you. So it helps that you get somebody like Pope Francis, writing an encyclical on this, and there's a whole kind of Laudato Si movement around the world of Catholics that are engaged in these issues, but it's still an uphill battle.
Yes, Itamar, please. Itamar,
thank you very much. Very broad and enlightening lecture. I'd like to ask, what is the Catholic position regarding vegetarianism or veganism in regards to environmental issues?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There is no official Catholic position on vegetarianism or veganism or meat eating. And so there just isn't, you can't point to a document where it has either been approved or disapproved. Catholics just take different positions on this and don't vary very much, as far as I can tell, from the general public on these issues. You do have certain traditions within the Catholic tradition of abstaining from meat eating. And so Fridays during Lent, and for some people Fridays, all Fridays, are traditionally a day where you abstain from eating meat. But that tends to have more to do with, it's more of an ascetic practice than it is a kind of animal rights practice traditionally, right? Meat eating was for what was a luxury. And so as part of the penitential practices of Lent, you would abstain from that. So there are, I have Catholic friends that are vegetarians or vegans for theological reasons. And a lot of it has to do with, I mean, for one of my friends, it's based on Genesis, right? That you don't get, God does not give the humans meat to eat until Genesis chapter 9, right? In Genesis 1, he gives them the plants to eat. And so meat eating is seen as a kind of sign of the fall. And you know, if you look at Isaiah, where you've got you know, the vision of the kingdom is where the lion and the lamb, or the wolf and the lamb, will lie down together. That they're kind of abstaining from the violence of meat and meat eating is also a kind of sign of the eschaton. So so there are some theological arguments to be made for vegetarianism and veganism, but there's no official position on it.
Okay, Karma, you had another question, and maybe afterwards, Karen too, you had another question? Okay, so Karma,
Thank you.
if you're ready.
Yeah. So okay, I'll try to say what I have in mind. So when you're proposing this theocentric perception that is an alternative for both the perceptions, both the Anthropocene perception and the critical perception that is biocentric. So you started with explaining this as theocentric, and then the word that you mentioned, and also Francis, is first the father, right? We are looking at creation or parts of creation as sisters and siblings, and then because we all have one father, and then you move to the incarnation. So after that, and this move was very interesting to me. It also connects to the way you answered my question on natural law, because you said something about a universal perception and the problematics of giving a perception that is not the particularism of the Catholic faith is somehow absent from that, or at least in terms of the self-perception. Even though, as you mentioned, it's very Catholic for the rest of us, right? So, and this also reminds me of many things that you're doing with analogies, right? The Trinitarian analogy and the way that it reflects on human society and how human society can model itself somehow in relation to that. So I was wondering if theocentric is the right word, or this is something that maybe is better for you to mediate this for a non-Catholic audience. Would it be more of a Christocentric perception? So what is the particular Catholicism of the perception of our relationship with creation and with God?
Yeah, gosh, that's really interesting. I want to use the term theocentric in part because I think a lot of people can participate in that, right? I mean, that would, I mean, the Jewish tradition and the Muslim tradition and Christians and, you know, lots of Hindus, lots of people can participate in that vision. If you get down to the specifics, then you know, Christians are going to explicate that in ways that draw in the incarnation and the importance of Christ for the Christian tradition. And I think that's a good thing for Christians to do, because that's an important part of our tradition. And so the idea of incarnation is the idea that God actually takes up material creation and is not opposed to that. That's not, you know, I think Muslims especially kind of regard that as a kind of idolatry. And the Catholic tradition emphasizes the kind of sacramental nature of that, right? That God is infused in material creation, but doesn't thereby erase the difference between the creator and the creation. And that then leads to all sorts of practices that I think can be very useful. So I talked a little bit about the Eucharist, that can be very useful for an ecological spirituality.
Just to add to your answer to karma, it's interesting. Spinoza, who said Deus sive natura, links to this issue. It's God that is in nature, nature is in God. But it takes us in a different directions, but it's...
Right. Yeah, I think Spinoza would be a little bit closer to pantheism than I would be comfortable with, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a different. Yeah.
Can I ask question or?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. I wonder about the anthropocentric and the ecocentric or biocentric relations with the theological centric, because if we look about the theological centric, it's kind of another relations that we can put in a way in the both sides, the anthropo, the person, the people, or the ecosystems. And so I wonder what is the added value to our ability to acknowledge the idea of this relation with the theological perspective, because in my point of view, it maybe can be added to the anthropocentric perspective. So, or in a way, because still we are doing with the people and their relation with the spiritual or the God or this kind of thing. It's in a sociological regime. So what is the added value to the ecocentric or the biocentric when I can look through the theological centric? It's I'm asking because it's very interesting to me.
Sure.
Because I all these two kind of perspective, but not the theological. So I want to know what the added value of that.
Sure. Yeah. So part of what I was trying to point out is that there's this kind of tug of war between the anthropocentric and the ecocentric or biocentric approaches. And that tends to be kind of zero sum. So either you put humans at the center and then, ecology gets degraded, or you put the environment in the center and then the humans kind of are a nuisance or not, And so I think the added value is that you unite those two perspectives in a kind of higher perspective, right? So that God is in both humanity and in creation, and God is what is kind of pulsing in both in the material creation and in the human beings that are made in the image of God. And so there's this kind of higher synthesis where you're looking towards the flourishing of all of the parties involved precisely because they are revelatory of something that transcends them, rather than just this kind of, tug of war between the pitting the interests of one against the interests of the other. So I think that in a nutshell is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Yeah, but one of the main things that I'm trying to get at is looking more specifically at the actual kind of economic forces that are driving ecological destruction, and not remaining at the abstract level of, anthropocentrism versus ecocentrism and theocentrism, because you can make an easy synthesis in thought, But unless you actually look at the structures of our system of production and consumption and so on, then it's not going to make much difference.
Okay. So I think we come to an end of a very interesting session of this conference. Thank you, Professor Cavanaugh, for a challenging, fascinating introduction into a problem that engaged us in a very serious and intellectual manner. I hope that the day will come that the political ecological situation here will make it possible for you to come and
theological too, you forgot.
Yeah, integrate on a more intensive and personal way. Thank you very much. Have a very good day. And
amen to that. I hope we all meet in person. Thanks so much for your attention and for the invitation.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Good evening to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.